just you and I.
How's it going, guys? Public Safety Network here. Got an interesting topic today. Someone I was talking to wanted to for me to discuss use of force policies at security companies, departments, whatever. And so I'm going to kind of talk about that today. Now, most people understand what use of force is. It's pretty much the amount of force you would need in order to gain compliance from someone. If you look at the use of force continuum or whatever it's called now, obviously the lowest being officer presence or guard presence or whatever, all the way up to the use of deadly force. Now, why most people who have been in the industry a while kind of have a fundamental understanding, that's kind of not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about specifically companies that develop policies for use of force. Now, why use of force is governed by federal law, case law, and state law, most companies develop policies regarding use of force, not only tailored to federal and state law, but also to kind of the amount of liability that the company itself wants to take on. Now, we're going to kind of discuss certain things that probably need to be required in order to what I would deem a good use of force policy. And I'm going to talk about some red flags that you should probably look at when looking at a security company for possible employment. Not all security companies are created equally, and some have, some like to skate the line of shady practices and just inefficient and neglectful practices. And these are kind of things you want to look at when you decide to take employment from a security company. Now, when you develop a use of force policy, you want to look at a number of factors. You want to look at, again, how much liability, the level of training your officers have, et cetera, et cetera. There's, quite a few things factor in. So what exactly should be tailored into a use of force policy to make it an effective one? Because when you make a use of force policy, you want it to be pretty definitive. You want to kind of have it spell out exactly what is allowed and what is not allowed, and kind of what situations, force might be appropriate, and then also kind of what types of force are allowed. And so we're going to kind of break each one down a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about some red flags at the end that you want to look for when looking at a company's use of force policy. One of the biggest things you need when creating use of force policy is, first of all, you need to kind of authorize what type of force is allowed to be used. There are certain places that do not allow certain types of defensive tactics or defensive weaponry. Batons is one I've seen that a lot of companies have kind of started to shy away from. Chokeholds is another one. The use of a chokehold in order to gain compliance out of a subject. That has also been kind of deemed prohibited by a lot of security companies, and even a lot of police departments have no longer allowed the use of chokeholds in order to gain compliance. So these are things that you want to incorporate into the policy, saying what type of force is allowed and what is not allowed. You need to make it very clear under the circumstances that they're allowed to be used, or if they are not allowed to be used under any circumstances. And those things kind of need to be illustrated in your policy. The next is, what type of situations are guards or officers allowed to use force? Is it strictly in self-defense? Is it in defense of a third party? Is it, if your state allows it, is it the restraint of a non-compliant or combative subject? I mean, these are all things that need to be outlined so that your personnel know when it is okay for them to use force. A lot of times you can't just say these are the types of force to be allowed, but then not give them any kind of situations or kind of scenarios where the force would be okay to be applied. Okay? Number 3 we need to look at is, as we talked about, prohibited use types of force. If you're not going to allow them to carry certain types of tools, or you're not going to be allowed them to use certain types of defensive tactics, that needs to be outlined in your use of force policy, because that's good for them to know, because obviously your guards or your officers or whoever wants to be able to follow that policy when it comes to doing their jobs. And if it is definitively outlined in that policy, then they're going to understand it, and there's also going to be no excuse for error if for some reason that they violate the policy. And then the last thing I think in order to incorporate into a good policy is, what is the procedure for reporting use of force? Is it it gets reported to the supervisor and then nothing else? Is it reported to the supervisor and then a use of force report is conducted? Is it all those things plus an incident report? Does the supervisor have to conduct their own report as well, or is it just the guard? I mean, these are all things that need to be thought about. Then also treatment of subjects. Now, obviously, a lot of times when people use force on a subject, they have to. A lot of times it came down to that situation and they had to do it. But what steps are you taking to treat the person afterwards? A lot of times you can't just use force on someone, like seeing someone in the face and then do nothing about it. Now, obviously, certain situations dictate the kind of level of treatment you're going to provide. Some places it's you only call the fire department or paramedics if the person's having a bad reaction. Sometimes it's call the fire department regardless. Once you go see someone or tase someone or whatever, these are all things that need to be incorporated about what type of treatment needs the guards or supervisor needs to provide after they've used force on somebody. If they shoot someone, do they have to attempt to provide life-saving treatment if it's clear? I mean, these are all things that need to be outlined when creating a solid use of force policy. All right, so those are kind of 4 things. That there's probably many other things I could have touched on, but those are probably the 4 ones I feel are the biggest that in order to create a good use of force policy need to be incorporated. Now we're going to kind of talk about some red flags you need to look at when looking at companies, as potential employers, and some things that really need to kind of perk your ears up a little bit when it comes to their use of force policy. Now, obviously, the biggest one is if they don't have one. So if they don't have a use of force policy, I am running for the hills. I would never consider employment with that security company, and that right there is going to get guards in trouble because there is nothing to back them up if they were ever inadvertently had to use force on someone. So, no use of force policy, no employment. I'm telling you that right now. The next one is the use of force policy is only verbal. Any good policy is written down. They usually, and not only written down, but also open for view. You'll have a lot of companies that will say, well, we only share use of force policy with people we hire. That doesn't fly with me. Not only do I want to see that your use of force policy is written down, I also want to see it before I decide to take employment with you. Because I want to know, what type of backing am I getting here if I was to be involved in a use of force situation. All right, number 3 is the use of force policy is abnormally vague. What I mean by that is it does not give definitive types of force that are allowed to be used. It does not give definitive situations in which force is allowed to be used. I mean, these are all things that are important for the protection of the guard, because if they have an incredibly vague use of force policy and then you go out and use force, I guarantee that company is going to try to use the vagueness of their policy in order to cut strings and not have to back you. If you operate within a definitive policy, then the company has to back you in your actions, because you are following the directive that they gave you. As long as you're acting not only within policy, but also within your state, local, and federal laws. That's also something to look at as well. And that's going to kind of bring me into my 4th point. This isn't really a red flag, but it's definitely something to be wary of, and then maybe something that you want to bring up to your current company about if they don't do this. So there are companies out there that actually specialize in writing uses of force policy. There are companies out there that you literally pay them, and they will write your use of force policy for you. A lot of really small police departments use these because they just a lot of times don't have the staff or resources to kind of create their own, so they just pay a company to do it for them. So if you have a smaller company, and maybe that's something you need to look at, is pay a company to write a definitive use of force policy for us. Second thing, if you are more comfortable with writing your own policy, and that's something that the company and whoever is in charge of that department feels comfortable doing, then I would always advise having it looked over by an attorney. There are attorneys that specialize in these types of things, or at least have some experience in this field of use of force, and it's best to have them look over it for obviously the company's protection, for the guard's protection, and then also to make sure that you're compliant within state and federal law. Because just because you have a use of force policy doesn't necessarily mean that it's with compliance of what the state or the federal government has to say when it comes to use of force. All right, guys? So this is kind of all I really have to say about the topic. I kind of briefly touched on it. Like I said, leave in the comment section, guys. Is there things that you feel I need to add, or things I didn't touch on? Do you have your own use of force policy horror stories that you'd like to talk about? You know, the comment section is kind of an open field where people can discuss ideas, give me new ideas myself for videos, and just be an overall discussion, guys. So like I said, thank you for the support I've received over the last few days. I've gained a few more subscribers, more views and watch time, and like I said, the more this channel grows, guys, the more that I'm going to be putting out. So like I said, if you haven't already, watch the other videos I have, you know, give it a like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, like my Facebook page, and again, thanks for all the outpouring of support, guys.